Self now. Right, guys, gonna start. So this is from underground POC to exploited CVE. I'll give you a couple of minutes in case you're at the wrong talk. You won't hurt my ego too much. So starting this off in a bit of a strange way, I've been working on this slideshow for a while, which I will come back to. But basically, I decided about a couple of days ago that the title doesn't really fit what the contents is exactly anymore. So I have changed it to Cool Stories You Can Tell with Advanced Threat Intelligence Collection. I appreciate that probably isn't as sexy a title, but what I can say is all the content that was in the previous one is still in this. There's more, right? So just trust me on it. I'm going to explain it more later. It's good slide content talking about why I changed the contents of the presentation, right? Okay, so firstly, quick raise of hands if you are a student or you graduated in the last year, just so I can get a feel for the place. Right, good combination. Right, cool. Reason I ask that is twofold. Firstly, I might use terminology that you might not have encountered yet. That's not to belittle anyone. It's just cybersecurity, like anything. You don't know certain phrases until you know them. Normally, you hear something, you're like, what's that? You go and Google it, and then you know it for the next time, right? I will do my best to explain things as I go. If I miss anything, I'll do questions at the end, and you're welcome to just come and find me with a pint later, and I'll explain it in more detail, okay? The other reason I ask that is I can be a bit more self-indulgent with my who am I. The reason I say that is just purely because I remember being about to graduate and not really sure what the next thing was. I knew I wanted to work in cybersecurity. I knew that there was a thing called pen testing. I knew there was something called a blue team. Wasn't really sure much beyond that what a career path would look like. So we're going to do a kind of 10-year retrospective on me. I like talking about myself, so that's fine. I will try not to bore everyone, but look, maybe I'll give you some inspiration. If nothing else, it might show you how a career in cybersecurity can change in a number of ways. You don't really know what you're going to be doing in a couple of years, and I mean that in a good way. Yeah, okay, right. So my cybersecurity origin story. It's a good way to start any presentation. I was in, I think, the end of fifth year or start of sixth year at high school, and I had a substitute computing teacher who no one was really a fan of. She had pretty bad chat at the best times, but she came in one day and she had this really funny story that she was desperate to share with everyone. And that was that she had bumped into a former pupil who was back on holiday from university, and he served her in Sainsbury's or something like that. And basically, she found it hilarious that this guy was doing a degree in, can you guess it, ethical hacking. How hilarious is that, right? Bear in mind, as much as it pains me to say it, that was like 15 years ago, right? There weren't that many, degrees in cybersecurity was a relatively new concept. The cybersecurity industry is at a very different place than it is now in terms of how mainstream it is. There definitely weren't targeted Instagram ads trying to get me to start a cybersecurity career, which feels like a painful waste of someone's advertising money at this point. But anyway, but yeah, so I was looking for something to do. I knew I wanted to work with computers. I hadn't figured out what that thing with computers was. And that joke, as bad as it was, kind of set my kind of mind in a way that I thought, that sounds quite interesting. So I could do some cybersecurity stuff. A few hours of YouTube later, and I was writing dodgy batch files, and here we are now, right? Okay, so I am a Abertay University loyal. I graduated 10 years ago. If you're good at maths, you'll be able to figure that one out. I was originally planning just coming to meet up with some of the people that I graduated with 10 years ago, so shout out to you guys. Back in the day, digital forensics was a separate degree than ethical hacking. I believe now they're kind of more of an amalgamation. Effectively, same thing. There were just a few different modules, right? Anyway, had a really good time at Abertay, learnt lots of lessons. That was great. Before I finished my degree, I got offered a job as a cybersecurity graduate working for an online gambling company called Betfair. Now, Betfair, a few years prior to this, had quite a big data breach, right? And normally what happens when companies have a really big data breach is they massively invest into their security team. So they had this really good, really like mature, very experienced cybersecurity team. There was lots of people in it. It was down in London. It was a really great opportunity. At the time, they had a 2-person data security and digital forensics team, right? As much as a 2-person team can be a team. And anyway, I was going to just slot right in there. Sounded great. As I said, I wasn't that sure what I was going to be doing after uni, but using the degree sounded like a good place to start, right? So moved down to London, and day one found out that a couple of months before I started, the digital forensics team had been moved outside the company. It did not exist anymore, and I was going to be doing cybersecurity strategy. Now, if you're wondering what a digital forensics graduate would know about the cybersecurity strategy of an online gambling company, I'm still wondering that. So it didn't last very long. I got moved into the governance and compliance team, which I know people who work in that industry, so I'm going to be polite, but it wasn't my kind of thing either. Anyway, eventually we merged with a company called Paddy Power, and with that came new opportunities, as mergers often do. And I started working as an infrastructure security analyst, primarily just looking at like network changes and stuff. More in the direction of what I wanted to do. It was more kind of hands-on in terms of cybersecurity. But the big thing for me there was I started going on call for Betfair and working more on with their MSSP and responding to incidents. Now, I feel probably it's not a good idea to like divulge what a company's MSSP is, right? That seems like bad practice. But coincidentally, in 2017, I started at a company called SecureWorks, and they were at the time quite a large MSSP, and that's where I've been since, right? So I joined the SOC, where it was a lot of phoning up Americans in the middle of their night, telling them that someone had downloaded dodgy malware. Saw some great times in the SOC. There are a lot of people here that I know from that time in the SOC, which is great. And you know, SOC's like perfect entry point in cybersecurity career. If I could have just skipped the bit before and started there, that would have been great. But you know, lessons learned. It's all cool. Anyway, after about 18 months, moved into a team called. Well, I started delivering an AETD service, which is Advanced Endpoint Threat Detection. And I was working as a senior intrusion analyst, so I was working on kind of endpoint forensics on a light level. So I was working with the endpoint agent formerly known as Red Cloak, Carbon Black, which was the big thing at the time, and this like kind of new thing people were starting to use called CrowdStrike. So that was really good. Got a bit more experience, way more what I wanted to be doing, seeing bad things happen for real. Then moved into a service called ATD Elite. You know, it's cool when it's got Elite in the name. That was delivering proactive threat hunting. So now I'd gone from working with like a very large base of clients to working with a very small number that were very high profile targets, that had either, well, that all of them had been previously compromised by either nation state APTs, advanced persistent threats, or large cybercrime gangs, basically, right? So these were high profile targets. I was looking for the threat. That was cool, enjoyed that job, and then I moved into the role I'm in currently, which is as a CTU researcher. CTU is the team that I work in. It's the research branch of SecureWorks. It stands for the Counter Threat Unit. Probably my favorite thing about the job is that, like, when you meet new people and you're sitting in the pub and they ask what you do for work, I can say I work in the Counter Threat Unit. It's a cool job title. These things are important. Anyway, but my main responsibility in the CTU is on collection of intelligence, primarily from incident response, but also human intelligence and to an extent OSINT. And that's going to be part of what we're talking about today, right? We are going to definitely be talking about bad guys doing bad stuff, but we're going to be kind of looking at what kind of stuff are we finding out to do that, okay? As I say, it's a bit abstract, but we're going to get there, right? That is my gratuitous about me done. Very quick thing about SecureWorks. This is not a sales pitch in any way, shape, or form, but I feel it's good for context. Been around since 1999. As of this month, we're now a Sophos company. I haven't updated the branding on the slides, so hopefully no one in marketing sees this. But basically, we started off doing more MSSP work, managed security services. We transitioned to being more based on our XDR platform called Taegis, which is obviously the best thing since sliced bread. We also do like incident response, managed security services. We still do a lot of things we did before, but now we also have this big shiny product to detect the threat and help people. Context of this is the CTU research team kind of sits at the heart of this. We are telling the XDR service what bad looks like. We're working with incident response to help understand more the bigger picture about the threat. Threat intelligence is a core to a cybersecurity company like this, and we do a lot of our threat intelligence research in-house, which other companies will buy their stuff in. That's cool, but we do it ourselves, which is fun for me. So this was the original title. It wasn't the original title, but this is the original blurb, right, for this talk. I didn't write this blurb, okay? So this original version of this talk was presented at the SecureWorks Summit at the end of 2024, which is a free online virtual conference. I promise this isn't a sales pitch, but you can go back and look at it if you want. It's a load of SecureWorks researchers talking about really bad things that are actually happening, cutting edge malware, advanced persistent threats, updates on what China's doing, updating what Russia's doing and Iran, and it's interesting stuff if that's the kind of thing you care about. So I didn't write this blurb, marketing wrote this blurb. If I was going to write the blurb, what the original concept of the talk was really is we heard about bad guys doing bad stuff, we heard bad guys talking about doing bad stuff, and then we saw bad guys doing bad stuff, and you should patch your shit, right? Fundamentally, that was the concept of the contents of the talk, and we're still going to do that bit, right? But I watched back the on-demand session, and I was like, it's a fine talk. It's a good talk. There's nothing wrong with it, but there's a bigger picture that I think we can kind of share here, right? If we take a step back, really, there's something to take away for how do we see that? How do we get the context into that? Every single person here, if you were going to work in cybersecurity, has a shared mission, right? It's not just putting money in your pocket at the end of the month. It is whether you are public sector, private sector, red team, blue team, purple team, even the godforsaken compliance people. Our job is to protect against the threat, right? Protect against the threat. And fundamentally, the best way to protect against the threat is to understand the threat. And the best way we understand the threat is ultimately by collecting the best possible intelligence, right? And that's the kind of preamble for what I'm next going to talk about, right? So, threat intelligence, right? Rather than do any original work, I thought I'd ask ChatGPT to tell me what threat intelligence is within the context of this presentation. And it said this, I'm not going to read it out, but fundamentally, it's about, as I say, understanding the threat, right? Threat intelligence is understanding the threat so that we can protect against the threat. That's our shared mission. No matter what you want to do, you want to stop the bad guys doing bad stuff. Part of that is looking at the bad guys doing bad stuff and seeing what they're doing, right? So, within CTU, we do kind of three broad buckets of collection sources. So, this is us going out and seeing what the threat is, right? How do we understand it? We kind of loosely bucket into three piles. They're all interconnected. You could break it into way more piles than this, but we're going to do it for the sake of this presentation and it not lasting forever. So we have third-party intelligence. So this is intelligence we have not created in-house, or we've not seen, we've not observed it firsthand. Two sources being OSINT and privileged source. So OSINT is your open source intelligence. That can be from anything light and like a blog post on some new malware and might have some file hashes and talk about its capability, right the way through to something like, and this isn't a plug, but Sophos did a really good report on Pacific Rim, which is a massive Chinese APT activity. It's a huge report. It's got loads and loads of stuff in there, really valuable indicators if you want to protect yourself against Chinese APTs and get really stuck into the weeds with it. They all count as OSINT. It can be light touch. It can be super not light touch, and that's fine. We also have a lot of privileged source ingestion. So within SecureWorks, we work a lot with government across the world, government intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies. Obviously a privileged source, so without going into too much information, if you just in your mind envision what kind of government agencies might be interested in learning about nation state threat actors, what the Chinese are up to, what like Russian cyber criminals are doing, right? Those are probably the organizations that we're interacting with on a regular basis. The next source that we have, and this is kind of my baby within my job, right? So I'm biased to how good this is, but is we collect from our incident response. So I talked about one of the services that SecureWorks does is incident response. Effectively, someone gets hacked, call up Sean, who's one of our incident responders, and they'll be like, right, come and tell us what's happened. Back in the day, we'd have flown over to a data center and got an image. Nowadays, that doesn't really happen as much. It's just remote, right? So you plug it in and do it all virtually. But fundamentally, what they're doing is seeing real hacks that have happened, building the story, the timeline of what's happened, telling what's happened start to finish. And me, as the threat intelligence person, can come along and see their findings and see firsthand what badness really looks like. So the reason that it's great is we can trust it fully. We're not relying on someone else telling us what bad looks like. We're seeing it for ourselves. Even from privileged source, super legit government organizations still make mistakes, and they'll say things are bad that aren't bad, or they'll miss part of the picture, and that's fine. It's human error. So we can avoid doing that. We can trust what we're seeing. We also see the attacks as they're happening. So obviously, when you're dealing with bad guys, the best way to get bad guys to change what they're doing is release a public report saying what they do. Okay, so a lot of the time there's a delay between badness happening and reporting on badness. So we get that, we kind of skip that step because we see it as it happens. And then the part that's way more interesting is the human intelligence collection. So this is another part of what my role is on a daily basis. And we are monitoring cybercrime activities, the human element of cybercrime activities, across various online platforms. So the bit that's interesting is that we spend a lot of time on kind of dark web forums and marketplaces where bad guys hang out and talk about doing bad guy stuff. And our job is to go and spy on them, basically, right? Infiltrate them, pretend that we are part of the bad guy world, and gain intelligence that way, right? So kind of dark web 101, 3 layers of internet. Surface web, that's basically stuff that you can Google. Your deep web is unindexed things, so you can imagine, even technically you could argue things like a corporate VPN or something, right, where you need to know the address to go find it. And then you have the dark web. That's where you need additional technologies to connect to it. One most people are probably familiar with is Tor. In order to go in some of these forums, you have to be using the Tor browser in order to connect to the dark web. So we monitor, let's say, a lot of communication platforms. We're on a lot of Telegram channels. We're on a lot of dark web forums and marketplaces. It's worth saying, I feel, whenever you're talking about dark web, that I feel like this is kind of more in my mind as a cybersecurity graduate, what I thought cool cybersecurity things would be doing, hanging out in like the underground. But you do have to take this stuff kind of seriously. Obviously, I don't think I need to make the statement that there is like legitimately really not good stuff on the dark web. We are not law enforcement, so we have to bear that in mind. We have certain processes in place to try and avoid things that go outside the remit of cybercrime, right? When we're entering real criminal activity, abuse images, etc. The positive is that, I guess the sayings like there's honor amongst thieves is kind of true in a lot of these forums. So a lot of these forums, if they are focused on cybercrime, they are pretty strict with not allowing things outside of that. And that can go on multiple levels, including, like, for example, just not having like abuse images, for example, just wouldn't be allowed. They would be banned. They have quite strict moderation, way stricter moderation than most like real life forums, for sure. But we even see some ethics within the cybercrime communities themselves. For example, I feel like it's dropped off recently, but for a long time, a lot of the forums wouldn't let you post, for example, access to a hospital, right? If you had remote access into a hospital, they would take down your post because they don't want people to be hacking hospitals and like good places and schools and that. I would say that actually that's changed a little bit over the years, in the last couple of years especially, and it seems to be a little bit more of a free-for-all. Anyway, that's kind of a side tangent, right? Just the reason I just say it is, like, if you're going to go and do some research, right, make sure that you're just being sensible with it, right? Because just viewing certain things can be its own kettle of fish to deal with. Okay, so when we're on these dark web forums, the way that we kind of integrate ourselves with them is through the use of personas. So the researchers who do this as our day-to-day jobs, we have multiple personas for multiple forums where we have like fake names and email addresses basically, and we have kind of character profiles. Some of them, it's a case of like typing into ChatGPT, translate as though you were a Russian hacker, and and it'll spit out someone that sounds about right. So some of them were in different languages, some of them have different interests, different careers, etc., different ways that they would construct a sentence. And we try and interact with the threat actors on the forums in a multiple ways. We can try and sometimes pull strings to learn a little bit more information. If we have seen in the past, for example, some of our clients being posted, and we might interact with the threat actor to maybe get them to reveal how they've got access or proof that they have access or something, so that we can maybe go back to the client and tell them how they could stop it, right? And in some cases have even bought access and data to take it off the marketplace, but obviously without misusing it, right? It's a complicated process. There's kind of legal frameworks in there that are a bit wishy-washy, but either way, I think it's a fun part of the job, to be honest. This was a real persona. So at the CTU Summit, this persona was officially burned. So if you were on Ramp, which is a hacking forum, this was an actual person who, well, not an actual person. This was an actual persona that was interacting on the forums as though they were a hacker up until like a few months ago, basically. Okay. Now we're kind of going to get to what the talk was actually originally about and combine the sources of threat intelligence. So firstly, I'm going to be talking about CVEs. There's a lot of TLAs in cybersecurity. It took me a long time to realize that TLA stands for three-letter acronym. CVE is short for Common Vulnerabilities and Exposures, right? And basically, it's where there's been a publicly disclosed vulnerability, right? It gets assigned a CVE, and that's how we know to talk about it. Sometimes they get good names, but not always, right? You like it when they get a good name because I'm not spitting out a load of numbers at you. So the way that I'm going to demonstrate cool stories that you can tell with threat intelligence and good threat intelligence collection is by picking 3 CVEs and doing just that, combining the sources. What did we see, right? What kind of narrative can we create for the badness? So first one is a 2023 vulnerability called Citrix Bleed. I like this one, because it was really, really prolific at the time, and 2, it's got a good name, right? Everyone loves a good name. It basically was an information disclosure vulnerability in NetScaler devices. Big thing about that is that they're on the perimeter of networks, right? Or they're publicly accessible. So juicy target for getting into a network, right? Fundamentally, buffer overflow of sorts. The main thing is that because it allowed the attackers to read the memory at the end of the buffer, that included session tokens. So if you have a session token, you can impersonate an authenticated user. And so if you successfully exploit this vulnerability, you could authenticate into the environment as though you were, legit, basically, right? So this is effectively, for the purpose of this conversation, OSINT on it, right? So this is a CISA disclosure on the vulnerability. CISA are the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency in America. So when they're talking about something, it's something people should probably pay attention to, right? And this is basically them saying, we've seen badness, this has the capability of being bad, people should patch, right? That's going to be a common conversation as we go through these. There are only 3, but all of them, the remediation is patch. As you go through your career, you will understand how painful that is. So this is XSS, which is a Russian e-crime forum. So what we have here is the threat actor profile is posting up the proof of concept code for this exploit, right? So in here is the exploit. This is it working. Go wild, right? Now we have some bad guys interacting with them. This guy's asking if we could hook up with Census, which would allow for larger scale vulnerability scanning. Other guys just bigging them up. As I said, it's a weirdly close community in these places. People are looking for some help. They're not getting it to run properly, but obviously they're quick to help them out and will point them in the right direction. As I say, they're discussing these vulnerabilities, and they want other people to use them because this is fun for a lot of them. Yes, it's how a lot of them make money, but a lot of them it's just about breaking stuff. I think we all understand that fundamentally, being like cybersecurity students. That's part of the fun of it. But we need to remember that this isn't hack the box exercises. This is like real infrastructure that's being targeted potentially. So we're going to look at, this is just a really brief overview of a real incident response engagement for Citrix Bleed. So what we saw was an initial login at 10 a.m., which had the first sign of the Citrix Bleed exploitation, which is available in the logs. You can go back and see that it got exploited. 7 minutes later, after getting access, presumably just for the time to someone got a notification that it worked, they ran NetScan, which is your recon tool. They then laterally moved a minute later. They then set up some persistence with a tool called Zoho Assist, which is our remote admin tool, effectively. And then several hours later, a file called one.bat was created and executed, and that was distributing a ransom note for Lockbit ransomware. Okay, so Gold Mystic is the threat group name that we give Lockbit. All different research companies have different names for stuff, right? But this is what we call it. And yeah, so this is how a threat actor, within several hours, went from using that exploit to attempting to deploy ransomware. I'll be honest, in this particular case, they actually weren't successful in deploying ransomware, but they tried, right? And the point, that's the story I'm going to tell, okay? So brief history in Gold Mystic, not just because why not? They're a financially motivated cybercrime group. They operated Lockbit, which is a ransomware as a service scheme, probably the most prolific one of all time. If not, it's right up there. Hugely successful, stole huge amounts of money, and it's been plenty in the news compared to most of them. They started off in 2019. They have had several version updates through the years, including getting their source code leaked, which in the cybercrime community is an interesting thing. One, because everyone else could start picking it up and building their own ransomware based off that, but also it then meant that we as the security companies understood how it all fundamentally worked, so they had to change what they were doing again and released Lockbit Green. And then in 2024, this was the original end of this slide. They had something called Operation Kronos happened, which actually Skirts was a part of, which is a cool thing to get mentioned by some of these agencies, but they got their leak site seized. The government agencies kind of trolled the bad guys. So this was their leak site, and they defaced their leak site with basically saying that we got them. There have been a couple of different versions that happened. That originally was the end of this slide, but actually, since the first version of this slide has been released, Lockbit are back, right? They're currently poking US government agencies and trying to wind them up, which is interesting to see. A lot of arrests were made, and there were, as far as we're concerned, this thing was shut down, but these guys have a way of just coming back, which is the nature of the beast, I guess. So this was leak site data. So the graph is basically showing how many leaks we see on these ransomware as a service schemes. The big spike is towards the end of 2023. So not in October itself, it's at the end of the year. But that's because it takes time before the victim would be posted on the leak site. So there's a period of time they have to pay the ransom, and then they get posted. After Citrix Bleed, as I say, it was a hugely successful campaign. It was like the biggest spike in ransomware victim shaming that we had seen in quite a while, right? Over the last that year period. So, kind of circling back to the cool stories that we tell with threat intelligence collection. this is kind of a rough timeline, right? There's way more parts to this that you could have added, right? But from our perspective, this is the main timeline. October 10th, Citrix published the advisory. So Citrix come out and say, we know that there is a vulnerability in our systems. Release a patch, that's the important part, and go and say, guys, you need to patch your stuff or you're going to get hacked, right? Now, October 25th is the first time we see it mentioned in the underground forums. And obviously, we're not on every single one, right? But we're on the main ones. XSS that I showed you is one of the most prolific forums. And that was the first time we saw it across all of our forums that we monitor. 5 days later is where we see our first IR gig for Gold Mystic. Between August and November, we see a big influx of various cybercrime activity involving Citrix Bleed. And then December 9th, we actually see another ransomware group. This is Inc. Ransomware, who we track as Gold Ionic. They start using it for their own campaign. So the lesson learned in this particular case is if everyone had just patched their stuff on October 10th, nothing would have happened, right? But that isn't what happens. What happens is it gives people plenty of time to figure out the proof of concept code, share the proof of concept code, improve their code, get it working, and then launch highly profitable cyber campaigns off the back of it. And the longer people don't patch, the more people pick it up and will use the exploit. This is a boring slide, but it's basically the same patch, okay? Next, CVE. I'm going to refer to it as Avanti. It didn't officially get a cool name, right? But it was a code injection 0 day. So presume we're all familiar with the concept of 0 day. You get zero notice. The exploit's just out there. People are using it. So this allowed unauthorized and malicious code to be executed remotely. What was interesting about this one is it combined itself with a previous vulnerability from 2023. So if everyone had just patched in 2023, this wouldn't have happened, but it's, again, recurring themes. And effectively, the previous vulnerability was an authentication bypass. So you stack the two together. So you had an authentication bypass and you had the code injection, and that's just a nice recipe for bad things happening in your network, right? You could run the bad things without authentication. So here is some OSINT. It's published. People know that it's being used. I don't know if we have the dates there. That's early January, January 10th. People are talking about it. The cybersecurity industry is aware. Now we start seeing it on the forums. This is on XSS. So someone's just asking about it. They don't have the proof of concept code, but they're asking their fellow e-crime guys if they can help them out. And someone posts them a GitHub with the exploit code in it. Share your experience. Let me know how you get on with it. We're all here to help each other. Someone's asking if there are any vulnerable IPs for testing. Someone kindly provides them a list of vulnerable IPs. Again, this is not hack the box, right? This isn't a fun exercise here. These are like legitimately vulnerable IPs belonging to real businesses that are casually being exploited here in the wild. So you'll notice I didn't have an IR investigation there, right? The reason is basically it was a very, very straightforward investigation the first time we see it. What happens is a backdoor called Glass Token gets dropped. So I'm not going to go back, but if you went back to one of the OSINT, it mentions that it was being exploited in at least one case by Chinese APT, Advanced Persistent Threat. So this is hacking groups that we have attributed to potentially being backed by the Chinese, effectively. And they started early January. January 11th is the first time we see it in our incident response data. It isn't published until the 12th of January, right? 0 day. So at the start, you've got a good excuse because no one's told you that you're vulnerable, okay? These people are being hacked, and even Avanti were likely not aware of the issue at the time. It's published, and at this point, there's an ongoing Glass Token web shell campaign. Whenever we see this Glass Token web shell being dropped, that's what we're attributing back to the Chinese. It wasn't something that's commonly available by your average cyber criminal. In February, a month later, we start seeing it being talked about in the underground. That's the forums post that I was showing you. People are asking, how are we getting on with this? And they start discussing it. And what's interesting is from February onwards, Glass token drops off. So there's little to none in February onwards of Glass token being distributed. And instead, the CVE starts being picked up just by general malicious cybercrime baddies, right? So the cool story to tell here is more speculation, but is it the Chinese likely were involved in the development of the exploit in the first case? They might have been the first ones to find out that the vulnerability existed. So they were quick to the gate. They use it for the short period of time until the vulnerability is disclosed and people start patching, and then they move on to the next thing. Cyber criminals being slow to the gate, as I say, they probably weren't discussing it for a bit later because they weren't necessarily the ones who developed it. Did the Chinese maybe decide to stop using it because its popularity increased massively when cyber criminals started picking it up, and that way people were more likely to patch? I don't know, right? There's speculation there. It's interesting seeing the handoff there between nation-state activity and e-crime activity, because while they are interlinked, they have separate objectives. We kind of spoke a bit about it in the keynote this morning. The Chinese APT activity is often based on stealing information. It's much less money focused. It's more about bigger pictures than that. Now, in our IR case, we think it's probably unlikely that they stole like some, what's the word that I'm looking for? Like basically the espionage part. We're not sure what they took away, right? But there was an espionage element to it. We find a lot with Chinese attacks that they kind of will do a wide spray and not be too targeted. That's not in every case. There are lots of targeted cases as well. But once they have the access, they might then go and find out more about whose network they're in and then take the next steps. Cyber criminals much more likely to just spray and pray and see what they get. Okay. Remediation was patch your shit. This is going to be a recurring theme. Right. The last one is move it. So this is a good old-fashioned SQL injection vulnerability back in 2023 again. So move it is, I've got this written down so I get the quote right, but basically it advertises itself as, quote, a secure way to transfer sensitive data for businesses, right? So that sounds like a pretty good target to me, right? This is an entire application that's based around businesses transferring sensitive data. If you're a bad guy, that's a good place to start, okay? So what this allowed was effectively just getting access to the backend database, right? Just get straight into the data that people are trying to securely transfer. So start seeing it in this is the proof of concept code for the move it exploit. You can see there, it uses the SQL injection to obtain an API access token. And that's them sharing it on XSS again, I believe. In this case, we're actually seeing it being sold, right? So before we were seeing it and the cyber criminals were just sharing, like, hey, here's my exploit, go wild, right? Let me know how it goes. This is a slightly different tangent where people are actually selling the exploit code. Now, more often than not every time, more often than not, the what's being sold is quite often just the proof of concept code that's available for free, because cyber criminals are a fan of scamming themselves, right? I mean, like I say, there's honor amongst thieves, but not that much honor. So, but maybe they have their own flavor on it. Maybe there's something in it that makes it easier to work. I'm not entirely sure. Either way, they're selling the same thing that someone else was giving for free a few days ago, and we can see in this case still being sold by another threat actor as part of a bundle in this case. Sounds great. And that was in August. So another quick incident response once over of a move it engagement. So exploit is used, drop a web shell. they then download 2,264 files straight from the server. And in this case, just over a month later, they're named on the leak site for Gold-Tay, which is the group that we attribute to Clop. Although they don't just do Clop ransomware, they have a bunch of things that they get on, but this is a very much smash and grab, right? This is, as much as we like to think as cybersecurity professionals, and it definitely as students, that the bad guys are super advanced doing some crazy stuff and sitting low in networks for months on end. Those days are not entirely done, but they are largely past. And more often than not, it's smash and grab attacks. I don't have a slide, and it would have been a cool slide, but if you look at average dwell times for APT and, well, definitely for ransomware attacks, they have reduced year on year massively. They just want to get in, earn their money, and get out, right? As I say, when I started looking at this, there was a lot of people being in networks for weeks, months, gathering stealthily, living off the land and all that. And it's not always that interesting. I say, yeah, they appeared on the leak site in this case. So a little bit on Gold-Tay. They're another cybercrime group, so they're focused on making money. They're also known as Fin11 and TA505. I think our naming scheme is pretty cool, but it makes better, reads better than Fin11 anyway. They've been accessed since 2015. They operate Clop, however, they started off more as malware distribution for Dridex and TrickBot. They didn't create it, they were just distributing it. They then started making their own malware, getting inventive and creative and trying to break out the box. They worked on TrueBot and Flawed Army. And then in 2020, they started doing large-scale zero-day vulnerabilities, so they would get these 0 days and hold victims to ransom, not always with ransom. Sometimes they would just exfiltrate a bunch of data, and then they'd get in touch with the business and say, hey, we've got your data. If you don't give us money, we're going to post it online for free. So that's what's happened in the previous case I looked at. There was no Clop ransomware, even though these guys have that capability, because it's more effort, right? It's another step to go through. A lot of the time nowadays with ransomware, people will just restore their stuff from backup, and that's how it is. A lot of things are now virtual, so the need for deploying that ransomware where you could just exfiltrate the data, it just makes life a bit easier, basically. They've had a bunch of notable incidents. So they've been individuals have been arrested by Interpol before. In 2020-21, they were exploiting selling on FTAs. 21 of October 21, they exploited SolarWinds Servview. 23, they went pretty mental, right? So they exploited Go Anywhere MFT. They exploited Papercut and the move it transfer that I'm talking about. So cybercrime groups using lots of different techniques, but fundamentally following the same patterns. This is one that we can see their way of working has evolved over time. As I say, they started off doing more malware and then moved towards this kind of ransomware scheme. That's our just extortion scheme in general, very typical of cybercrime groups. Things come and go, they come in trends. Some things are more easy to pull off at one point and become harder to be profitable later on. And that's just, I just find it interesting tracking these things, right? This is the part where threat intelligence this directly is not protecting anyone per se, right? But it's letting us understand the threat. And as I say, the better we understand the threat fundamentally, the better we can protect against the threat. This was the Clop leak site by month, or I think it might be by day, maybe by day or week. I probably should have checked. Anyway, the point is that they went pretty ham and got 264 in the period of, let's say, a week, maybe it's a day, when this 0 day came out. So remember, 0 days, obviously, they haven't patched yet. So they're just getting as many victims as possible before the patches come out, before anyone can do anything to protect themselves. So kind of very rough timeline here. So advisory comes out for Move It. I said the wrong thing. The last one was a 0 day. This is not a 0 day, right? Just pretend I didn't say the last part, right? So May 31st, Progress released their advisory. So they tell everyone that it's being exploited. Next day, we see it in IR. So they are still very quick to get on the vulnerability or get on the exploit even. Proof of concept code then gets released publicly. So there's some significance there with the fact that the threat group were using it before the proof of concept code was released publicly. So they had obviously figured that out within their own development. That wasn't something that they just casually found on Git, which is often the case when it comes to publicly available exploits. We don't see it mentioned in the underground right up until June the 12th. And then following that, we start seeing it for sale. We see it multiple times for sale. It starts being bundled in packages of, come and buy our series of exploits. They work and they're good. And we, as I say, we see 3 more engagements after June related to the Gold Tejo group using that exploit. So lesson learned is if everyone just patched at the start, then they wouldn't have had this problem, right? As I say, it's a reoccurring theme. For those who are graduating or have just graduated, this will be the bane of your life for the rest of your career. People don't like patching, and that means that people will keep getting hacked. And it's pretty much as simple as that, okay? If you're not locking the door, then people can walk in. So here's just, it's unrelated to any of the previous incidents. This is just a bad guy selling a list of CVEs. The point is kind of demonstrating that these forums are super busy. They offer a wide range of services. There's no shortage of exploits that people can buy and use. It's also worth noting that some of these are old, right? Like 2019's on there, a whole bunch from 2019. There's a couple from 2018. These are the most exploited CVEs. They're still, at this time anyway, we're still being used regularly because people aren't patching. They're still getting compromised. As much as 0 days like the Chinese APT activity is cool, that makes for a really good story. The reality is often much more mundane than that, and entry is much more easy than finding a 0 day. It is just a case of finding the key that works. So these were the original takeaways for the original slide. As I say, that was at the Securi-Tay Summit. Threat actors use the underground to talk to each other. They help each other. We see very clear patterns of timelines between bad guys talking about doing bad stuff and bad guys doing bad stuff. Again, going back to that was the original point. We can't really do much about 0 days. Just have quick plans in place to fix against them. Patch management is important. Patch your shit. I don't know if I need to say that anymore at this point, and then have good backup plans. So that is the end. If you've got any questions, does anyone have any questions, or you can come and ask me? Yep. Yep.
Similar characteristics, but there's some really pervasive terrifying implications.
I mean, I don't have any specific insights on that off the top of my head, but I can say that it's certainly prolific. That's for sure. I think we'll keep seeing those type of vulnerabilities crop up. I think that as people still don't patch basic things. In the end, eventually everyone will get around to patching, and then someone will find a different way of doing the same goal. It's just about seeing who's doing it. With something that prolific, it's generally not the more advanced adversaries that are using it. But yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Other questions? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, so there's definitely a flow. We'd often find So, I mean, firstly, right, we don't actually know until people get arrested. That's obviously the statement, right? They aren't that casual about saying it. If you look into, for example, the Lockbit, there was a lot of work went into kind of building out what the Lockbit team looked like. But the reality is that we thought we made the arrest in order to stop it, and it's come back. So a lot of the time, there's like a core backbone of people that are behind the threat group, and as people may, there's a lot of splintering in groups. A lot of the time, they might have disagreements on what to do or directions that they want to go in, or if they want to hack hospitals or not, or whatever. And then they go off and start their own ransomware gang or their own criminal group and kind of splinter off. It happens all the time. But yeah, some of them are surprisingly big, especially if you look at groups like Scattered Spider, which is a very prolific threat group. They're like hugely multinational, lots of members across the world. There was an arrest in Scotland last year related to it. And yeah, they're a lot of these organizations are very big. How involved different members are is interesting. A lot of on the forums is where the recruitment goes on, which sounds like a plug, but please don't do that. But it's very commonplace. That's also changing itself. The more high-profile groups nowadays don't do the advertising on the forums. They're interacting with people that are known. A lot of the profiles that exist they become notorious, right? People know the name, and yeah, there'll be an inner circle that while we are in some cool forums and we're in some invite-only forums, like for example, we have one account that is a typo of a well-known account, and they let us in, for example, right? So we do have some of that access. There's always going to be some things that we just can't see. So yeah, I don't know if that answered the question, but right. Yep, we'll do Paul after. Yeah, so I mean, for Operation Cronus, if I'm being like completely transparent, the main researcher who was involved in the actual takedown was kind of sequestered off, and he wasn't talking to the rest of the team that he was a part of the takedown until after it happened, because that's just the nature of an investigation that big with that many agencies. We're more we monitor a lot, but with a lot of the threat groups, we're not hugely involved. There have been cases where we have talked about, I don't know if we ever did it in the end, but like for example, uploading fake victim data in order to like perceive that we were part of a threat group. There's a lot of things we would like to do, and there's also a lot of potentially like illegal questions that start coming into that, so it gets a bit complicated. So I don't know if that's a good answer or not, but it's the best thing to do. Paul? Versus what, sir? Versus what, sir? It's a mixed bag. Sometimes it's quicker, but we do, with the relationships we have with government agencies, we do sometimes get quite a head start on things compared to public release for sure. Normally, it's not more than days or weeks, but sometimes it just depends. A lot of the time, it depends on if there are other things going on, other moving parts. Maybe they're investigating something to do with it. And also, obviously, when they publicly disclose a vulnerability, people start looking for it, which is a big issue as well. We wouldn't be able to disclose. No, we wouldn't be able to disclose where the source is because it would be a privileged source. But we could tell them that they've been compromised. But it depends, like if there's been a patch released and that kind of thing. So there might not be anything they could do, theoretically. Blair? Oh, sorry. Oh, sorry. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Come and ask me questions later. That's totally fine with me as well. All right. Cheers.